This is going to be Gnostic Media episode number 189. Been a while since you've been on.
It's been a while. I've been too busy with other things to do any of this thinking until recently.
Jay, welcome back to the Gnostic Media podcast for your third time.
Okay, I'm glad to be here, Jan.
You know, you and I have kind of done some work behind the scenes over the last couple of years with Joe Atwill and whatnot, and compared a lot of notes and everything. My research on Wasson and McKenna, your research on Carlos Castaneda, etc. And interestingly, we discovered that it all fit pretty darn well together, didn't we?
I'm amazed at how pervasive the intelligence agencies' influence on the so-called psychedelic movement has turned out to have been, and maybe we're just now getting the awareness of what they've done to really divert a whole generation, and now into the second generation, away from any kind of constructive political activism and even exercising our democratic rights, and into some kind of never land full of pseudo shamans and so-called psychedelic drugs.
Well, in, what was it, July 2011, I think it was, I went to your place and we did an interview together. And at the time, you weren't sure that the CIA had been behind the disinformation campaign, etc., which you had published as well in your book back in 1993. So what do you have to say to that today?
Okay, well, we've learned a lot, and I think you've helped me to see what I suspected was absolutely true. The Freedom of Information Act requests have clarified the fact that Richard DeMille, Barbara Meyerhoff, Carlos Castaneda, evidently Terence McKenna, and of course R. Gordon Wasson were connected and or employed by the CIA. They won't disclose the complete records for the individuals we've just mentioned, because supposedly it's protected by national security, whatever that means to them.
Yeah, well, what they said was that a search would reveal agency affiliations, you know, and it's funny they use all of this sophist wording, which of course is what the CIA is about sophist wording, but a lot of people think that, you know, that they didn't find any responsive letters means that they didn't find anything at all. All that means is that they didn't find anything that they're going to respond with. Everything that they found, they're keeping to themselves.
That's right. That's what I finally understood was responsive means that it's something that they can give us, and they may have lots of information that you and I and others would like to have, but they're for whatever reason, supposedly national security, deciding not to allow us access to that. So, you know, before we get into any more details, I want to state that I really think 2014 is the year we need a comprehensive review of congressional oversight on the Central Intelligence Agency. I think it's time now, in light of what you and I and others have been finding, and of course Snowden, and now today we get this FBI file that was stolen out of the FBI's office in the early 70s. I think it's time to review what kind of oversight we have had or haven't had, and what we need going forward. So I think this is a good time in American history to take a look at our oversight of the intelligence agencies.
Now, you're wearing some interesting garb there that I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, what the heck is Professor Fikes wearing there? And I'm sure they want to know everything about it. Is this, you know, what's going on with Professor Fikes here?
Right. Well, the shirt is from the Ho Chunk or Winnebago society, and this is a group that I came in contact with through my political advocacy with Reuben Snake, Native American church roadman and political activist. And the beaded necklace is Tatenive Tokame. It's our mother in heaven, the one that sends us one of the spiritual components that keeps us alive, Kupuri. And then this is a little Mexican beaded lizard that represents the spirit of the boy that became the Sun Father. So this is all to remind me of what I've learned from my teachers, Native American and Huichol teachers, so that whatever I do is to honor them. Whatever words I speak should be increasing the respect we have for real shamans and real Native American believers in the peyote spirit.
You know, since the last time you were on, Joe Atwill and I published our article, Manufacturing the Deadhead, that exposed quite a lot. And, you know, so your work, since the last time you were on, and our work kind of combines. And Joe and I think the last show that he and I did together was one on weaponizing anthropology, which you and I are going to be going into more depth on. You are a professor of anthropology. I think you just retired from Yeditepe University in Istanbul, Turkey. Is that correct?
Well, I'm about to retire. I have some doctoral students that I don't want to abandon, so I'm going to try to work out a way to remain active on their committees, because they need my help, and I want to help them to complete their research. But I'm definitely not going to be able to teach in the foreseeable future. So I'm all but officially retired now.
All right. Why don't we dive into Carlos Castaneda? The first time you were on the show, we went into your book, Carlos Castaneda. In fact, why don't you hold it up there? Carlos Castaneda, The Psychedelic 60s and Academic Opportunism, or I think I said that wrong, Academic Opportunism and the Psychedelic 60s. And you've made a lot of new discoveries since that episode. And when was that? Was July 2011. I forget the episode number, but people can search that on the website.
Right.
Why don't we start off by talking about Carlos Castaneda and some of the updates that you've found since then and since you published your book in '93?
All right. Well, I think the most important is the birth certificate that I obtained through a friend in Peru. And the birth certificate is something I sent you a copy of, so you know that I didn't manufacture what I'm saying here. The birth certificate shows that he was born on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1925, in Cajamarca, Peru. This is a town in the mountains of Peru. And his father and mother were not married at the time he was born.
So he was a bastard child.
Yes, he had no parents that were married. Now, this is significant, I discovered, I think, because this goes to the heart of his idea about erasing personal history. And this is something he advocated in his books and something he did in his personal life. So how does this relate to not having parents that were married? I think he felt ashamed, and we have to think back to 1925 in a conservative Catholic world that he grew up in, what that would mean. So, you know, I'm guessing, and I think correctly, that people made fun of him and made him feel bad about that lower status that they ascribed to him, not having parents who were married, being a bastard, as we would put it. So he did actually do a great job of erasing his personal history. I mean, you look at the BBC documentary, Tales from the Jungle, about Carlos Castaneda, and they hold up his death certificate, and it states that he was born in 1935 in Brazil. So even after he died, the lies continue on the death certificate. So he lied to everybody, including his wife, Margaret, about the details of his birth. And obviously, this is because he didn't want to admit the truth. He preferred a more grandiose explanation of who he was. And the most interesting thing is, I think you can see clearly what he said in Journey to Islam. That was the third book. Lies are lies only if you have personal history. So if people don't know what your personal history is, they don't know that you're lying. And this was his modus operandi throughout his life with everybody and in his books.
Now, you had found an interesting episode regarding Castaneda's migration to the United States, and you had shared this with me, probably about a year ago when you first discovered it. But now, supposedly, the boat that he took, that he rowed from Peru to the San Francisco harbor, was a boat that actually sits in the highest lake in the world, the highest navigable lake in the world, which is Lake Titicaca. Now, do you think that it was possible that that ship was brought down off of the lake and then made one trip just for Castaneda into the San Francisco harbor?
Well, he had a great sense of humor. Everyone that knows him says that is the way he came across. He liked the joke. So the only other possibility, because that ship could not leave Lake Titicaca in the highlands of Peru, there's no way. There's no outlet to the ocean from Lake Titicaca. So it's impossible.
It wasn't Peter Pan's ship? You're sure? Captain Cook's boat?
Well, there you go. He was certainly a sorcerer. Maybe he learned how to fly from his apprenticeship to Don Juan. But
well, you're gonna be planting ideas into the New Agers' heads, so be careful there.
Okay, but anyway, the SS Yavari, that's the one that's in Lake Titicaca, and that's a tourist attraction. People can go there, and I mentioned this on my website, www.jfikes.com. But there is one other possibility that someone alerted me to, and I have not tried to follow up on this. So I'm suggesting to the audience, if anyone wants to do this, it would be worth doing. There may be another SS Yavari, as unlikely as that seems. And the question then is, if it does exist, do we have a ship manifest showing that Castaneda actually arrived in San Francisco as he claims he did on that ship? So, if someone might.
So you're saying there was a chance of two ships named the same thing in Peru, right?
Somebody.
Now, isn't there a ship registry where they handle that sort of stuff? So
there is a way of investigating it, and I attempted to do that, but I didn't have the time to go into it as much as it would take to determine if Castaneda was even on that supposed second ship, and even if it exists. So someone emailed me and said that they had discovered there was a second ship, but I don't know if that's true. And I only found in my search on the internet the SS Yavari on Lake Titicaca. So as far as I'm concerned, unless someone can show me the ship manifest to prove that Castaneda was on an SS Yavari that arrived in San Francisco, that it's still not proven. It's still not something that we can take for certain about Castaneda.
What about Castaneda's popularity? How popular was he in his works when he was alive?
Well, he was clearly the best-known anthropologist from about 1964 to 1976, because he does have a doctorate in anthropology from UCLA. But even now, I mean, his books are still being translated into into other languages than English, and his popularity is not waning at all. So he's probably, arguably, the most famous anthropologist ever.
And it's really unfortunate when a fraud takes that position over real academics, isn't it?
Well, this is what upset me enough that I wanted to try to set the record straight. Was I saw that it was completely concocted. Don Juan was a fictional character, and that it was a composite that was built upon what experience Castaneda did have in Mexico, and he was there definitely with the Huichol, and I think also in Oaxaca, and then just reading what other scholars had written, and we have to emphasize, and his contact with Barbara Meyerhoff especially, and perhaps also Peter T. First. So he didn't do this alone. Only DeMille wants to claim that Castaneda did it all from the UCLA library. My research shows that he was actively collaborating, at the very least, with Meyerhoff. He had contact with the Huichol. And in that BBC documentary, it's clear also that he was in Mexico apart from the Huichol. They show his son shows this postcard showing he was in Oaxaca. There's a postcard showing a photo of Monte Alban, and it's got a Mexican 80 centavos stamp on it. So it was posted from Mexico to his son. And then Margaret has a letter that was also, I guess, posted from Mexico. And he states in that letter to her, Margaret Castaneda being his ex-wife, that he was in southern Mexico. So it's clear to me he was also in Oaxaca, and that's what he told Timothy Leary as well. So we have, I mean, he's lying about a lot of things, but clearly the postcard and the letter he sent were from Mexico. And clearly he was with the Huichol, because Guadalupe Rios told me that she met him there.
Now, regarding Richard DeMille, and he was a professor who was, quote-unquote, exposing this stuff, and he's the one that led the disinformation campaign against you, and he also led you on a wild goose chase for some time. We since know that he was a CIA. He was also one of the key founders with L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology. And so this is who Richard DeMille was, who was the first so-called debunker of Castaneda. And what the CIA commonly does is when one of their agents is bound to get caught, eventually, what they'll do is they'll kind of scapegoat them and make it, put them out for sacrifice and make it look like they did the whole thing on their own, because in actuality, we know, for instance, like Gordon Wasson, he headed MKUltra Subproject 58. We know that he worked with Aldous Huxley and Alan Dulles at the, Alan Dulles was the head of the Century Club the head of the CIA, and they worked together at the Century Club. But we also know that Carlos Castaneda, and we have the letters, met up with Gordon Wasson at the Century Club to have lunch with him and discuss all of this stuff.
Yes. Wasson basically was very careful about what he wrote about Castaneda, and he asked for field notes from Castaneda and supposedly got some, but it's clear to me that they're not really field notes. They're something that Castaneda provided for Wasson. DeMille, I had a very difficult relation with DeMille. What finally made me realize that he was not a normal scholar was when I asked him for a copy of the interview he did with Barbara Meyerhoff, because he only published part of it in his book, The Don Juan Papers. And there were nuances that I was quite eager to examine that would have been unpublished and contained in the cassette tape. So I wrote him and asked him for a copy, and he said that it was destroyed. He destroyed it and gave some very lame excuse about that. So another tactic that I see the people who are involved in intelligence work that they take is to destroy the evidence, so nobody can prove that anything was other than what they claim it is. So this is what he did. He destroyed the tape. So all we have is his word about what was in that interview with Barbara Meyerhoff. But if Meyerhoff herself was CIA, as it appears she was, then the two of them could have made up all of it, and we wouldn't know the difference because we don't have a tape to refer back to check up on them. So it's really disturbing that there's so little evidence, but the lack of evidence actually does speak very loudly. We have no field notes for this so-called waterfall jumping that I wrote about in the book about Castaneda. That really was just the tip of the iceberg, but it's the clearest example we have yet of the fact that none of those three scholars, first Meyerhoff or Castaneda, has any field notes or any recordings to corroborate what they claimed they witnessed, first in Meyerhoff with Ramon Medina Silva and Castaneda with Don Genaro, and supposedly this waterfall stunt that they all witnessed independently, supposedly.
And that's one of the big things that's touted around as like proof of the shaman's power, right?
That's right. The shamanic balance metaphor that they use is very important, and if you follow the use of that shamanic balance metaphor, you'll see that has become actually a kind of index of New Age pseudo-shamanism. They think that it's something very meaningful when in fact it's a concoction, it's a fabrication.
Well, sophists never mind concoctions. But, let me just mention Fierce. Now, Fierce actually had threatened your publisher for your first book that you published on this in 1993. Right. And your publisher backed down. Is that correct?
That is correct. And because of that, I decided to file a complaint against Dr. First with the American Anthropological Association's Ethics Committee. I considered suing him. I did go to an attorney, John Tomar, and we talked about it, and he gave me his ideas, and it would be very costly. That was the main reason I couldn't do it at that time. But at any rate, to get back to the main point, yes, First was actively defaming me. He was making up all kinds of defamatory statements about me. The only thing he didn't say was that I was a homosexual, because by that time that was politically incorrect by the 90s. Otherwise, he probably would have said that. But he had claimed I made a death threat and just all kinds of absolutely imaginary things to get people to distance themselves from me. But how did he do it? The publisher, he basically just said, I'll sue. I'm not going to point out anything that's wrong with the book. I'm not going to give you any page numbers, but if you decide to publish it, then I'll sue. So they backed down at that point because they didn't have any insurance. So what happened then? Okay, I sent a letter to the American Anthropological Association's Ethics Committee, and I was joined in that by Professor Phil Wigand and Juan Green. So the three of us all had our own negative experiences with Dr. First, and each of us complained about different things to the ethics committee, but the ethics committee, without any justification, discarded all three of the complaints, and they never gave us what First wrote to them, and they disbanded the part of the ethics committee that had to do with adjudicating.
So somebody on the ethics community was clearly dirty and being influenced there. Then
that's one conclusion. The other conclusion is that First maybe threatened to sue them, and they didn't have enough money, because that was why my publisher backed out. They didn't have the insurance.
But so that's what the ethics committee is there for, is to look into this whole thing, right?
Exactly.
So I mean, to me, it sounds to me like if these guys are all agents, and when you get into Fierce work, it's a load of crap. Most of it. Most of it's just garbage, and this guy is touted all over the place as some expert for anybody who wants to look up Fierce work and actually try to fact check his stuff. It's just a load of crap.
Yeah, but let me just interrupt for 1 second though, because all right, you're onto something that recently I have concluded does explain why they did nothing. It could have been the fact that they were worried about being sued by First. We don't really know, because they never gave me any reason for failing to research the complaints we made. So what you're suggesting is exactly what I've now begun to wonder, which, we're dealing with what Professor Price, who's done a lot of research on the CIA and anthropologists involved with it, and back to the OSS in World War II, what Price says in this article about Gregory Bateson in the OSS is that during World War II, as many as half of all professional anthropologists worked full-time in some war-related governmental capacity, and another quarter worked on a part-time basis, and many of them were involved with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. So yes, you're absolutely right. It could be that the CIA has penetrated American anthropology to the point that they don't want to expose a fellow agent.
Well, sure, and this is, I see this kind of. In fact, you and I have both experienced this type of thing going on with other professors in anthropology itself. You and I have experienced
definitely.
it.
Definitely. And this is a classic tactic that people need to be aware of, because it goes back to what happened to John Allegro when Wasson defamed him.
Absolutely.
And they just keep using this tactic over and over, because they can't refute our interpretations of what they're doing.
And
so the only defense they have is to create lies about us.
And do they ever even once address a single thing that we've ever written?
They don't address substantive issues.
Never. I've never actually had one of these disinfo guys address a single point that I've ever written.
So this is their modus operandi. When they can't refute it, then go on the attack and defame the person who's uncovered your phony work.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you this. How did Carlos Castaneda hook people?
This was very interesting. Of course, his first book came out in 1968, and there were three plants that were central to what he claimed was his gaining access to an extraordinary reality that was the world of the sorcerer, his so-called mentor, Don Juan Matus. So what were those three plants? One was peyote, two was Jimson weed, datura, and three was the psilocybin mushrooms. So Castaneda was at that point seemingly writing something authentic about his research in Mexico with this so-called Yaqui Indian sorcerer, and that these three plants were actually the teachers. Peyote would teach wisdom, and he would gain an ally, Castaneda would gain an ally through ingesting datura and the psilocybin mushrooms. So that was how we hooked people, because people were already, the audience had been prepared for at least 15 years, going back to Aldous Huxley, and the mescaline ingestion that Huxley had gotten involved with back in, I think, 1953.
Surprise.
Then there was Wasson in 1957 with the publication about the Mazatec mushrooms, and then, of course, peyote and the Native American Church. People already knew about that. So all of these, and Jimson weed was well known, at least in California. There were American Indians in California still using it. Still, some today may still be as well. So anyway, what Castaneda did was take this kind of interest in psychedelics and then take it out of its context in the United States and transpose it over to Mexico, which is exactly what Wasson had already done back in 1957.
What's interesting is these people all seem to be very adept at public relations, and Wasson obviously was trained by his close friend Edward Bernays, who is the father of propaganda. Terence McKenna admitted in an audio recording that he was a PR guy.
You mean, am I the alien ambassador, whether I like it or not? Well, I often, when asked this question, I've said, you know, it beats honest work. I mean, my brother is a PhD in 3 subjects and works in hard science, and I don't think it's brought him immense happiness, not that he's despondent, but I was always kind of a slider, you know, and certainly when I reached La Chirera in 1971, I had a price on my head by the FBI. I was running out of money. I was at the end of my rope. And then they recruited me and said, you know, with a mouth like yours, there's a place for you in our organization. And, you know, I've worked in deep background positions about which the less said, the better. And then, you know, about 15 years ago, they shifted me into public relations, and I've been there to the present.
You know, and of course, people don't get that a PR guy is a paid liar. And they'll say, well, you know, Terence McKenna liked to tell stories, and he was recruited by the mushroom. But get this, folks, somebody who is in propaganda, who is in public relations, is a paid liar there to fool you. A bard, if you look it up even on Wikipedia, it says someone who is hired by the king to tell the king's story.
Right.
You know, Terence McKenna went around all the time saying, I'm a bard.
Exactly. Well, we saw, you know, the damage they did with tobacco, claiming it was non-addictive, and they knew all along it was highly addictive. So yeah, I mean, this is a big part of PR, is to sell products. Now, in this case, with Wasson and Castaneda and First and Meyerhoff, they're not really selling products, but what they're doing is they're diverting attention away from a political movement that was occurring in the 60s, specifically with the anti-Vietnam War protests and the civil rights movement. They're diverting the attention away from that into this brave new world of psychedelics, that the pseudo, you know, world that they were creating for people with their so-called publications. And yeah, there was an attempt there to keep people from further examination of foreign policy issues, and specifically CIA involvement in all kinds of covert operations throughout the world. So this to me is the real motive behind much of the so-called publications on shamanism. And that's what people need to be aware of, is it is a PR campaign. It is definitely a public relations campaign.
The red herring for counterculture, as you called it earlier
it's
today.
A red herring for the counterculture. You give them a pseudo-reality, a separate reality, as Castaneda called it, that isn't real.
All right, so let's get into... Earlier today, before we started recording, you and I were talking about how the Romans did mind control as per Joe Atwill's work, and then we look at Gregory Bateson, and Joe and I did the show Weaponizing Anthropology together on Dick Price's work. Now I've tried to contact Dick Price, or Richard Price, whatever his name is, a number of times to get him on the show for an interview. He's never responded to me, unfortunately. But what we have then is this pattern from Roman into Soviet, and then the Soviet stuff is adopted possibly into the Piltdown hoax with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, etc. And then from there it goes directly into MKUltra. Would you like to expand on that?
Right. Well, we talked about how one of the things they do is to defame people, to call them, you know, dirty names when they can't refute logical arguments that are based on evidence. So the thing that the elites like to do, and I understood this when I read Joe Atwill's book, Caesar's Messiah, what the elite wants to do is to create a separate reality that diverts people's attention away from protest, from political struggle, and
Are you saying that, just to interject, are you saying that Carlos Castaneda's title of his book, Separate Reality, was tongue-in-cheek?
Absolutely. He knew what he was doing.
I bet, and I wonder how many of those book titles were just totally tongue-in-cheek, right?
Well, he
Journey
was.
to Ixtlan, probably, he's taking you on a fantasy ride, and
This is a good point you make, because this is something that comes out in Joe Atwell's book as well, is the Roman elite is actually doing a lot of parody on the people that they were conquering, meaning the Hebrews, the Jews that they were conquering. And you see this very clearly when you read his book. And Castaneda did exactly the same thing. He talked about, and this I want to give you one good example of it. He talked about how when Don Juan was harvesting the peyote cactus, he would have to sprinkle sulfur around the circumference of the peyote before he could remove it. So this is because the Spanish missionaries called peyote the diabolical root, coming from the devil, right? So the sulfur is a way to laugh at the Inquisition, but the Inquisition was not funny for Mexican Indians. They were tortured and executed if they were found to be using peyote during the days when the Spaniards were practicing the Inquisition in Mexico. So the parody we see is like laughing at the victims of colonization, whether it's Castaneda with the Mexicans using peyote, the Mexican Indians using peyote, or whether it's the Roman elite laughing at the Jews that they're conquering and torturing. So yeah, it's a real horrific form of putting down people through dark humor.
let's go into Gregory Bateson and how this whole thing ties together out of the Soviet history, going from the Roman out to Soviets, and then how did he bring it to us?
Okay, well, Bateson, what he did was he wrote.
And let me just interject real quick. Yeah. Bateson, he was the husband of Margaret Mead, and
Yes.
and the two of them were both at the Macy Foundation conferences. We know for a fact that both of them were key founders, along with Huxley and Wasson, etc., of MK Ultra. These two have been paraded around as academic heroes for the last 50+ years.
Well, I don't feel comfortable saying that about Bateson because his intellectual ability was something that inspired me. So
the point being is that he was a part of MK Ultra. He was one of the key founders behind all of this crap that's been going on, and we can prove that he was at the Macy conferences. He and his wife were both there. They were key figures helping to promote this entire meme that spread through society.
Okay, so anyway, what's relevant in terms of trying to understand the strategy that the intelligence agencies take when they want to divert or prevent some kind of protest is what Bateson gave them to think about. In 1944, he published a report that was given to the OSS, and later it turned up in the files of the CIA when David Price found it there through a Freedom of Information Act request. But anyway, what does he say in there? He says a lot of interesting things. But the most interesting for what we're talking about is that when the colonizers are thinking about the response that the natives may have to being colonized, they should keep in mind something called the native revival. And what Bateson meant by that was to find some aspect of the native culture that could be used as a self-esteem booster or a tourist promoter. So if we think about how this worked with the Huichol, it was clearly the beaded necklaces, the yarn paintings, and the peyote hunt that they used to get non-Huichols involved with Huichol culture and make Huichol feel that they had something very valuable and still have something very valuable. Bateson said this is the way that the Russians dealt with the natives in Siberia. They would let the natives exhibit for the colonizers some aspect of their culture, a dance or whatever it might be, singing, and they would then reward this. So they would be the spectators who'd be applauding this performance that the natives would give them. Why was this important? Because then the natives, even though they were colonized, felt that they were appreciated at some level by the colonizers. So this idea of a native revival was a way to kind of create a softer form of colonization that would prevent the natives from taking matters into their own hands and becoming more militant or more nativistic, which is what we saw with the ghost dance, for example, in the United States. So he was advising the colonizers, like the British and the Dutch, to use the same strategy that the Russians had used in Siberia to create a native revival and to reward them for whatever kind of trait that they had that they could exhibit and get the attention of the colonizer. And I think this is exactly what they did then later with the Mazatec and the Huichol and the Mayan. All of these waves, let's call them, waves of diverting American counterculture into Mexican Indians were predicated on the advice that Bateson gave back in 1944 of having a native revival, but I guess it got renamed later as the Archaic Revival. Is that what you understand?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it appears that Terence McKenna was familiar with all of this. And again, like I said, Gregory Bateson working with MK Ultra, working with Aldous Huxley, Wasson, etc. We know for sure with Huxley, I don't know if he and Wasson directly communicated. If they did, that would be huge. But then Terence McKenna takes this and remarkets it again as the Archaic Revival, which we discussed in our article, Manufacturing the Deadhead. So the theme here is neo-feudalism. And what we've also found is that aside from just this native revivalism, they do want to bring about a new dark age. In fact, Terence McKenna called himself a new dark age, or that he wanted to bring about a new dark age. And so, we have that quoted in that article. But so neo-feudalism was essentially the agenda, get us all back into a neo-feudalist society. And then, as I discussed with General Stubblebine in that interview, and he admitted that Aldous Huxley, as far as he could tell, was in charge of MK Ultra, I had discovered that it looked very obvious that Aldous Huxley was one of the key people, if not the head of MK Ultra, directing the studies, etc., to be done. You agree with that statement as the former head of Army Intel. And can you give any information on what Aldous Huxley's position was?
I don't think I should.
But that whole thing, all, the intel, all of that ties in together, and it kind of makes this nice little bow that they were using against us, trying to drive us, essentially using Huxley's Brave New World to recollide us into ancient Hindu society with the ancient Hindu caste system. The alphas, betas, deltas, epsilons in Huxley's book would become, the Hindu caste society became Huxley's, alpha, beta, delta, epsilon, etc. So this was the agenda, and this stuff goes all the way back to the Mahabharata. So, excuse me, do you see a continuity yourself with these strategies that the elites use?
Absolutely, and we didn't talk in much detail, but this is what Joe Atwell's book clearly shows, is that the Roman elite created a pacifist messiah because they were having such difficulty in getting control over the militant Hebrews, the Jewish freedom fighters, who were trying to keep the Romans from taking over Jerusalem and eradicating their religion and enslaving them, basically. But anyway, so how did they do this? They used specifically the book of Daniel, and they had the Wars of the Jews written by Josephus, who was an adopted member of the Flavius elite family. And he wrote this propaganda piece, let's call it that, because it was. He distorted dates of what the Romans actually did when they were conquering Israel and Judea, because they were two southern and northern kingdom. But anyway, so he distorted the dates to align the conquest that the Romans were carrying out under Titus, right, to make it look like it all fit the prophecies of the prophet Daniel. But it was a propaganda piece. And then the New Testament was written by somebody else. So these two supposedly independent books that appeared at the same time were a strategy by the Roman conquerors to create a pacifist Messiah and say that this was all prophesied in the book of Daniel, that Jesus was the one that was going to be the Messiah. So they set this up, and they knew that a lot of the people at Qumran, through the Dead Sea Scrolls, we now know this is true. This is what Joe has mentioned. They knew that the militant Jews themselves were waiting for a Messiah, but their Messiah would be a military savior, someone like Ataturk, who liberated the Turks from the Europeans who occupied their territory. So their Messiah would be a nativistic liberator that would eject the enemy out of the territory that they had always had as their own. So it's clear when you read what Caesar's Messiah is about. It's clear that the strategy is to use what people think is important, but to disinform them, to create a propaganda piece that gets accepted as a reality. It's the separate reality that becomes the reality after the elite pushes it out and gets the propaganda to be accepted. It creates this new reality, a new religion in the case of Christianity, and I think a new pseudo-religion in the case of all of this counterculture interest in shamanism. So yeah, there's no doubt there's a continuity here for 2,000 years.
What do you have to say about textual inconsistencies and contradictions?
Okay, this is very important, because what we mean in English when we say we have to read between the lines is that we take more than one text and we start to understand that there may be a contradiction when we look at one text and look at another, that two things cannot be true. That it cannot be true that, for example, with Castaneda, he said in the first book that the peyote teaches wisdom. There's a spirit in that plant, Tamatsi, our elder brother, his spirit is in peyote. And then we have Jimson weed and the psilocybin mushrooms that also have spirit, an ally. And then he contradicts that in the third book by saying, oh, well, you know what, this was not real. Don Juan only gave me those powerful plants so that I would shatter my worldview that was an obstacle to me understanding the world of sorcery, the world of Don Juan. So this is a contradiction. You can't have both. You can't have peyote constantly teaching you wisdom and an ally that you have for your whole life because you're using Jimson weed or the psilocybin mushrooms to gain access to that ally. You can't have that your whole life and then be told that, oh, by the way, there's no ally, there's no spirit in peyote. These are just plants I use to shake up your worldview so that you could become a sorcerer. And there were lots of contradictions like that DeMille and then that I have also discovered that show that it's a fabricated work. And the same is true in what Atwill does. He looks at the New Testament and compares it with the Wars of Josephus and realizes that they're not independent works. The two are a whole that that feed off of each other. So you have to have this comprehensive view of what a writer or what a text is really about. You have to have a more comprehensive view and not read it in isolation, not assume that the New Testament stands alone. And with regard to Castaneda, it's the same thing. Don't assume that his work stands alone. He was networked in with First and Meyerhoff and possibly even Michael Harner. So you've got this overlap that's there, and you've got these contradictions that are there in Castaneda's work. So it's all about disinformation, getting people to accept disinformation by hiding it from them, by making it look like there's something real that everyone is discovering for themselves. But it's not that way. It is PR.
You know, I was just looking up Gregory Bateson in the Brain database here, and he admits one of his largest influences is Aldous Huxley. We've got him under Harold Abramson. He's at the Macy conferences.
Harold Abramson gave him LSD for the first time.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And guess who he gave LSD to for the first time?
Now that I don't remember.
That would be Ken Kesey. Now we have in the online video a conversation about LSD where Tim Leary admits that they're all agents. He says our agents. He's talking about them driving around in a bus.
I think, you know, it's an interesting thing too. As you go around the country, I'm sure you all have this experience. You talk to middle-aged, fairly respectable people in Tucson, Arizona, and they say, this is where the acid thing really happened. Tucson. In San Francisco, this is where it really happened. The Lower East Side, you know, they say that's where it's really happened. And no one has ever really told the story what was going on in Los Angeles during those years. I think much more was done down here. There was a much wider range. There were more doctors involved. There were more scientists involved.
We had Gerald and Aldous.
Yes, right, yeah. And Ivan, of course. Then, of course, it was part of the coolness of the Los Angeles cell, whatever you want to call it, that they kept a, you kept a...
Well, you might not call it a cell. Let's call it a cluster.
Our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way. And it's never been as public as some of the other, you know, the buses running around the country paying.
Yeah, and then Zinberg says that the visionary experience and all the things he was doing at Harvard and the others, his residents and the rest that he was giving LSD to, they never had a visionary or ecstatic or mystic experience, but the whole thing was a California invention. He said, and he said, and the only time it ever happened was when you crossed the Colorado River.
He meant, you know, obviously the bus being Ken Kesey, so we know Kesey's an agent, we know Leary's an agent. Here's Bateson dosing Kesey. We also have Bateson at the Lindisfarne Association. Interestingly, at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Palo Alto.
Yes.
He's heavily involved into cybernetics, which we know is a part of all of this stuff. He's also at the Esalen Institute, which we know is a CIA front to pump all of this stuff out. And, of course, married to Margaret Mead. He's also associated with Norbert Wiener, who's very dirty. And there's some other good ones here that pop up in the database. But... you know, Bateson, along with, you know, what I want to do is a sort of comparison here. But Bateson, he was in the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA in Burma and in Thailand.
Right.
And then, as you know, this stuff that's coming out about Terence McKenna, he was doing deep background in East Timor in the 70s. So they both have this sort of same type of background. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, what I've learned about that from reading the David Price essay that I was showing to the viewers a moment ago let me just quote from that, from page 380. Bateson, during World War II, was designing and carrying out what they called black propaganda, which we call disinformation. He was involved with a team that produced radio broadcasts from remote secret locations in Burma and Thailand. He worked also in China, India, and Ceylon. And what they did, this group of broadcasters or disinformers, was they would represent what supposedly was the position of the enemy, meaning the Japanese who were occupying Burma, and they'd mix in a certain amount of facts, but then they'd also put in the disinformation to make the enemy appear more negative than they actually were, kind of defamation. And let me quote this about Bateson, according to Maybe, this author who wrote it in 1987. Bateson helped to operate an Allied radio station that pretended to be an official Japanese station. It undermined Japanese propaganda by following the official Japanese line, but exaggerating it. So this was anti-Japanese propaganda.
There's a book by I forget, General McClure maybe, that is called Psych War, and in there's a character called Tom, and your description reading about Bateson right there was almost verbatim to the description of Tom in Psych War against the Germans.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is classic wartime disinformation. And, you know, once you learn how to do it in that context, then you can do it anytime, anywhere. And this is why I think you and I both are upset about MK Ultra, is we're using disinformation on our own citizens. So this is very disturbing.
Now, what do you think? And you had read the bit on Terence McKenna.
That's right. Yeah.
Admitting that he was a deep background and propaganda agent for the CIA or FBI. You know, what do you think about? You read that short article that I sent you on that. What do you think of that article?
Well, it's very clear listening to him, and that was I guess a lecture he gave at Esalen Institute.
Right, and of course Esalen is a CIA front where all of the intel guys feel all at home with each other. You know. Yeah,
there's a lot of probably recruiting of people through that, I would guess as well. But anyway, yeah, it was transparently clear to me that he was admitting that what he was doing as an agent, which he says they recruited me, was PR, was disinformation, and it.
Wait, Jay, wasn't that the mushrooms recruiting him though?
Yeah, only for those that want to deny reality in order to hold him on a pedestal, even after he's admitted himself that he was recruited and functioning as an agent. So yeah, it's kind of funny that, but he's got a great sense of humor. This is another interesting thing that links him back to Castaneda. Also, is they're great performers. They know how to lie and to use humor to relax people so they'll accept the lies. But this was not a lie. I do believe that, based on what you found with your Freedom of Information request, that McKenna was an agent. It's clear he's admitting it there, to them, to that small audience.
Right, and they just never assumed that, you know, back in 93 or whenever that audio was recorded, they never assumed that it would go out to the whole wide world on the internet, and they'd never even conceived of such a thing as YouTube yet. So
well, that's a good point. That's right. They assumed perhaps that only this very small circle of people would hear him say that, and maybe he in fact made a mistake in saying that, but it was in good company, in quotes.
Sure. So, and of course, being a propaganda, you know, and being a propaganda manager or, you know, propaganda agent, you know, he makes a joke about what, you know, the alien ambassador and all of this nonsense, right. But this is just part of the storyline that they're always pumping out there to you know, dilute and confuse people. And then they go, well, see, he's an alien ambassador, rather than focusing on his words saying, well, I was on the run from the FBI and Interpol for drug smuggling. I got caught, I had bills to pay, yada, yada, and it's like, if you just look at the facts, you don't have to make things up. You don't have to appeal to, the mushrooms told him to do it and they hired him and they paid off the bills and they got him off the hook with the FBI. I mean, if the FBI offered him a job, couldn't the FBI get him off the hook? Doesn't that make more sense rather than appealing to magic?
Of course it does. But at any rate, let's go back to this wave after wave of diversion of the counterculture into to Mexican Indian cultures. This started with Wasson, with the Mazatecs and the hippies. At that time, that's what they were called. The hippies, the counterculture, went down there to look for the magic mushroom ceremonies, or maybe not even the ceremony, just give me the mushrooms. And then you had, and this still is going on today, you have people, invading the Huichol and going even into the sacred peyote country and making a nuisance of themselves, but praising the Huichol for the fact that they do have a peyote hunt, but commercializing it now at the same time, which is the classic example of this native revival that Bateson was advocating back in 1944. So we've got Wasson, who's popularizing the Mazatec mushrooms, and then we've got first Meyerhoff and Castaneda, who are popularizing the Huichol peyote hunt. And then I guess it's Terence McKenna that helps with the 2012 Maya propaganda, that it's the end of the world, however that gets interpreted. But it's, again, focusing people's attention over somewhere else instead of on all of the problems in our own country that we should be thinking about and trying to resolve. So it's the same thing happening again and again, whether it's Wasson or Castaneda or McKenna. They're creating a separate reality and diverting consciousness away from the problems that we can actually deal with in our own country.
What should we say about the Esalen Institute that we haven't already?
Well, there's one interesting thing. I got a tape done by Brad Segunda, who's one of these peyote hunt promoters. And that was based on a lecture that he gave, I think it was in 82, it might have been 81, at Esalen. And Brad Segunda, of course, at that time was taking people on tours into Mexico to see this Huichol shaman, Don Jose Matsua. The lecture for me was just amazing. The amount of disinformation in it was just phenomenal. And so I guess I'm a believer in what you say, that the Esalen, if it's not a CIA front, it doesn't matter to me. It's certainly involved in this attempt to divert people away from the real problems we're facing in our own country into this separate reality that these propaganda artists are creating.
And then we also have evidence that aside from Aldous Huxley, there was a handful of other people that helped fund and support Dick Price and Michael Murphy in helping set up the Esalen Institute. So we have this whole backgrounds, and tie-ins with the Esalen Institute. And in Huxley's book Moksha, he admits that he was at the Macy Foundation conferences on mind control, right there in that book.
Yeah, it is difficult. Let me say this: it is difficult for me to want to see this negative side in Huxley and Bateson in particular, because both of them were very important influences on me, as was Castaneda.
Well, and that's how they trick us every time, isn't it? Because if you think of McKenna, a lot of the audio that got out there today came from my personal archives, because I had a friend that worked at KPFK radio station. When she died in 2002, I inherited this whole set of archives. And so, people want to blame me for putting McKenna out there, but his books were already out there and he had already done the radio interviews. All I did was, release the tapes of them about a decade ago. And then in hindsight, I go, crap, look at this guy was dirty as can be, but,
yeah. It's hard to admit that we were fooled, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and so that, when I bring up stuff on Aldous Huxley, people get so upset all the time. And you know, he's been promoted. Well, you know what? He's always out there saying and warning us about this thing going on.
In an interview from 1958, which is available on YouTube, Mike Wallace begins with the following introduction. This is Aldous Huxley, a man haunted by a vision of hell on earth. A searing social critic, Mr. Huxley 27 years ago wrote Brave New World, a novel that predicted that someday the entire world would live under a frightful dictatorship.
Today, Mr. Huxley says that his fictional world of horror is probably just around the corner for all of us. How do you equate Hitler's use of propaganda with the way that propaganda, if you will, is used, let us say, here in the United States? Are you suggesting that there is a parallel?
Needless to say, it's not being used in this way now. But the point is, it seems to me, that there are methods at present available, methods superior in some respects to Hitler's methods, which could be used in a bad situation. I mean, what I feel very strongly is that we mustn't be caught by surprise by our own advancing technology. This has happened again and again in history. Technology has advanced, and this changes social conditions, and suddenly people have found themselves in a situation which they didn't foresee and doing all sorts of things they didn't really want to do.
Well, now, what do you mean? Do you mean that we develop our television, but we don't know how to use it correctly? Is that the point that you're making?
Well, at present, the television, I think, is being used quite harmlessly. It's being used, I think, I would feel it's being used too much to distract everybody all the time. But I mean, imagine, which must be the situation in all communist countries, where the television, where it exists, is always saying the same thing the whole time, is always driving along. It's not creating a wide front of distraction, it's creating a one-pointed drumming in of a single idea all the time. It's obviously an immensely powerful instrument.
So you're talking about the potential misuse of the instrument.
Exactly. We have, after all technology is in itself morally neutral. These are just powers which can either be used well or ill. It's the same thing with atomic energy. We can either use it to blow ourselves up, or we can use it as a substitute for the coal and the oil which are running out.
You've even written about the use of drugs in this light.
Well, now, this is a very interesting subject. I mean, in this book that you mentioned, this book of mine, Brave New World, I postulated a substance called soma, which was a very versatile drug. It would make people feel happy in small doses. It would make them see visions in medium doses, and it would send them to sleep in large doses. Well, I don't think such a drug exists now, nor do I think it will ever exist, but we do have drugs which will do some of these things, and I think it's quite on the cards that we may have drugs which will profoundly change our mental states without doing us any harm. I mean, this is the pharmacological revolution which has taken place, that we have now powerful mind-changing drugs which, physiologically speaking, are almost costless. I mean, they are not like opium or like cocaine, which do change the state of mind, but leave terrible results physiologically and morally.
Mr. Huxley, in your new essays, you state that these various enemies of freedom are pushing us toward a real-life, brave new world, and you say that it's awaiting us just around the corner. First of all, can you detail for us what life in this brave new world which you fear so much, or what life might be like?
Well, to start with, I think this kind of the dictatorship of the future, I think will be very unlike the dictatorships which we've been familiar with in the immediate past. I mean, take another book prophesying the future, which was a very remarkable book, George Orwell's 1984. Well, this book was written at the height of the Stalinist regime and just after the Hitler regime. And there he foresaw a dictatorship using entirely the methods of terror, the methods of physical violence. Now, I think what is going to happen in the future is the dictators will find, as the old saying goes, that you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled. And this they will do partly by drugs, as I foresaw in Brave New World, partly by these new techniques of propaganda. They will do it by bypassing the sort of rational side of man and appealing to his subconscious and his deeper emotions and his physiology even, and so making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in a situation where they oughtn't to be happy.
But let me ask you this. You're talking about a world that could take place within the confines of a totalitarian state. Let's become more immediate, more urgent about it. We believe, anyway, that we live in a democracy here in the United States. Do you believe that this brave new world that you talk about could, let's say in the next quarter century, the next century, could come here to our shores?
I think it could. I mean, that's why I feel it's so extremely important here and now to start thinking about these problems, not to let ourselves be taken by surprise by the new advances in technology. I mean, for example, in regard to the use of the drugs, we know there's enough evidence now for us to be able, on the basis of this evidence and using a certain amount of creative imagination, to foresee the kind of uses which could be made by people of bad will with these things, and to attempt to forestall this. And in the same way, I think with these other methods of propaganda, we can foresee and we can do a good deal to forestall. I mean, after all, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
But the issue is he never tells anybody that he was actually one of the key engineers behind it. Right, and, so in his book, Moksha, it's really clear in there that he's actually one of the key people doing this. But here's a quote that comes, it was found in the book, The Meaning of Race by Keenan Malik, and it comes from The Hidden Huxley by David Bradshaw. And Huxley says, quote, about 99.5% of the entire population of the planet are as stupid and Philistine, though in different ways, as the great masses of the English. The important thing, it seems to me, is not to attack the 99.5%, but to try to see that the 0.5% survives, keeps its quality up to the highest possible level, and, if possible, dominates the rest. The imbecility of the 99.5% is appalling, but after all, what else can you expect? And of course, Aldous Huxley's, grandfather was involved in this. His brother Julian Huxley was the first president of the British Eugenics Society. He headed UNESCO, where they pumped all of this stuff out. Aldous Huxley is up there pumping all of this out through the Esalen Institute and through his novels. And, so we can see that this agenda is going on out there. But, ironically, Aldous and his grandfather, Thomas Huxley, were some of the key people to dumb down the masses. And Thomas Huxley, he's the one that put in the compartmentalization in the universities. And then later on in his journals, in his diaries, he's complaining about his own actions and that it should be undone, but here we are 120 plus years later, and it never was undone. But let me just read you this quote right here. It's from Sir Thomas More, from Utopia, Book 1, from this early 16th century. For if you, the rulers, suffer your people to be ill-educated and their manners to be corrupted from their infancy, and then punish them for those crimes to which their first education disposed them, what else can be concluded from this but that you first make thieves and outlaws, and then punish them? And I see Aldous Huxley as one of the most evil sociopaths that have ever walked the planet. When you think of the fluoride in the water and all of the drugs being pushed, and these were all things that were Huxley's dream. He wanted the population totally dumbed down and medicated so that they would love their servitude. And in fact, when you read his book Moksha, his definition of transcendence is somebody who is so high that they love their slavery.
Yeah. It's a bitter pill for me to swallow that he was such a negative influence, but as far as the worldview, the way of understanding reality goes, with regard to Bateson, he was very, as you pointed out, very important in cybernetic thinking, and that's why I had a tremendous respect for him, because without a systemic, comprehensive perspective, it is hard to.
Well, get this: the cybernetics. Boy, oh boy, when you get into the background of cybernetics, that ties right into the Tavistock Institute, which we know is into that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Ted Kaczynski falls under that. Oh, boom! There's Terence McKenna. There's the Lindisfarne Association. Von Neumann, Bernays, Gödel set theory. We have mind control, psycho-cybernetics. ARPANET falls under cybernetics. So all of this mind control, all this stuff going on up at the SRI Institute, up at Stanford, falls under cybernetics. So cybernetics is very much involved in the mind control. So that should be one of your biggest clues that it is involved in all of this. But, you know, cybernetics, one of the key founders of cybernetics, other than Gregory Bateson himself, was I.A. Richards. Now, who's I.A. Richards? He's the guy who created the 850-word modern English language to go sell around the world that was a totally dumbed-down version of English. That's I.A. Richards. Now, I.A. Richards, he's... oh boy, he was involved with the classical trivium, but he influenced Marshall McLuhan, who wrote his PhD thesis on the classical trivium, which, as you know, McKenna, Leary, all of these guys cite, because the classical trivium, which is the misuse of the trivium method, is how they control people, and so that's why they're all big fans. Marshall McLuhan came up with tune in, turn on, drop out. I. Richards also influenced Bertrand Russell. We know that he was dirty and working with Huxley. Edward Sapir, Eric L. Trust, Ludwig Wittgenstein is there. And so, these names show up over and over. So, Gregory Bateson, when you start looking into his background and, even David A. Price's stuff, but, he's there right there at the Macy conferences. He's one of the key engineers behind this whole thing, and that's really how they sell it. Going back to Huxley, he goes, there at Berkeley and he's on the TV warning everybody, but he never tells you that it's him and his brother doing it, that they're the ones organizing it. He never tells you, like General Stubblebine did, that he's MI6 and CIA and that he's engineering the whole damn thing.
No, they have to hide that part of who they are in order for what they're doing not to be understood as something dangerous. But what is dangerous about it is a couple of things. One is that they're carrying out covert operations that impact our country. And these could be, helping Indonesia invade East Timor. They could be bringing the Shah to power and getting rid of elected leaders in Iran. It could be toppling Salvador Allende in Chile. So there's the covert operations that create a problem for us, as well as the ones that we might like, some of us anyway.
Oh, well, you mean, first we put Allende in power and then we take, is that what you mean by that? Or we put the Shah in power and then we take him out, that kind of thing? England and what's his name? The famous guy.
Bin Laden himself.
No. The Arabia back in the early 1900s, they made all the storybooks about and stuff. Oh, what the heck?
Arabia.
Huh? Lawrence of Arabia, that guy, and he's the one that fooled them all and got them under the thumb of England in the first place, So I mean, it's like, they do one thing and then they decide, I don't like this. We're going to change it later,
Right.
So they it's
there is that,
there's the Hegelian dialectic problem reaction solution. They create the problem, the people react, and then look, here's the solution. We're going to go in there and fix this.
Right.
So meanwhile,
that's a part of it. But then the MK Ultra that we're talking about is another part of what they're doing that I think has to be understood and prevented from happening, or stopping it if it is still happening, which it may well be happening even now. So this is the part of the intelligence agencies that we need to have oversight on, and we need to prevent disinformation from being used to control us. when we're in wartime, what Basin did to me is justifiable, because after all, you know, if we're fighting a war, we have to use disinformation.
Right,
But
well,
outside of that context, it's a different reality.
And there's always the issue of you know, the illegality of a standing army under the Constitution and all of this stuff as well. So, I mean, you know, technically we're supposed to have the sheriff and the militia, and we're not supposed to be in East Timor or any of these other places committing illegal acts and then having to go in there and correct them. So, you know, if you don't do the one thing in the first place, you don't have to fix it later on, or so-called. So, I mean, you know, anyway, you get my drift on that. So
I understand what you're saying there, but what I'm saying is
you don't do something illegal in the first place and then, you know, try and correct it with other illegal actions in the second place.
Yeah. I mean, we can go pretty far in the reforms that are needed, but I think for starters, the focus has to be on getting more control over what is done by intelligence agencies that are supposedly protecting our national interests. Then we can debate what national interests are.
Sure.
But you know, I think
here's a better plan: level the playing field with the trivium method, and get the intel agencies out altogether. You know.
Yeah. Ultimately, if people are educated, then they will be able to prevent these things from happening. Yes, but until they are, these things will continue to happen. There's no doubt that it's going to be that way. So it's very important that we try to get people to learn how to read between the lines, to look for contradictions, to look for things that are public relations schemes rather than a reality in its own right. So yeah, I think this is where we have to start. Then we debate how far we go with the reforms once people are to step one, where they can see that they have been manipulated and lied to. So that's where I'm at. I'm still just trying to get people to the point where they can begin to think for themselves again, if ever they were there. But certainly that, you know, I'd like to see a robust United Nations, because if we go back to East Timor, the United States basically gave intelligence and military hardware to Indonesia so that they could invade East Timor. And Patrick Moynihan, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, talks about what a great thing it was that the UN was so ineffective.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree with you on that, because there's a lot of the Cecil Rhodes Trust. You've got the Morgan family and all of these corrupt sons of bitches creating the UN, and then the UN is actually driving Agenda 21, which ties directly back into MK Ultra and all of this stuff that we've been talking about. And unfortunately, the UN has been used as a way for the United States to, you know, protect Israel's crimes and things like that. Whenever any country has an issue, the U.S. always vetoes it. And, you know, Israel and some of these other countries have gotten away with really horrific crimes against other cultures. So I'm going to, you know, Richard Grove is really exposed a lot of the UN and that kind of stuff on his show, but I'm very leery of that whole thing. And when you get into researching Agenda 21, like James Fadiman, the last legal LSD researcher in the United States, his wife, who was Ken Kesey's girlfriend, right back there again, she makes Agenda 21 propaganda films for the UN today. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I mean, the 60s counterculture people went either into the CIA or into the UN, essentially. And what about, let's go into the attacks on you. What do you think about, what do you have to say about the attacks that have happened on you over the years?
Well, I see a real parallel between the UN and the American Anthropological Association, and that being that neither of these institutions is able to control things that they claim they want to prevent, like misconduct or genocide in the case of the UN. So they're basically PR as far as I'm concerned, and maybe you'll agree with that at least.
Right.
It's a PR tactic to put an institution like
up there. Doesn't it even more so, though, doesn't it eliminate our individual sovereignty as a nation to be able to do things either nationally or even locally when we have to answer to things globally, to this, this UN run by a bunch of international bankers?
The institutions that we set up obviously require oversight. And with respect to the anthropologists, they didn't exercise any oversight. They decided that they would no longer even attempt to investigate allegations that there's ethical misconduct. And so it would be like the UN saying, well, you know what, we're not even going to talk about genocide because we're not going to do anything about it.
We're not going to talk about Palestine or anything. We're just going to turn our heads and pretend it didn't happen.
That's right. So that's where the Anthropological Association left me, was to say, well, guess what? We're not even going to investigate anything that is allegedly misconduct, which means plagiarism's okay, fraud's okay, defaming other anthropologists is okay. There's absolutely no oversight. So in a zero-sum game world, which is where the capitalist economy is, if we exercise no oversight, then you've got the war of all against all. And so what I'm saying is basically, in a nationalistic world where you have wars between nations, and World War II was the last really huge one, we have to have some institution that is capable of stopping aggression. And the United States, you're right, in terms of the record, the United States itself is committing a lot of, or letting
it was 72 wars the United States has declared on other nations since the 1920s or something like that, and all of them illegal. All of them against the Constitution. Not a single one of them was against a country that did anything to us. But, Jay, what is the single most important concept that you want people to take away from this interview?
Well, I think that we have a couple of emotional issues, all of us, to deal with. We have to be able to admit we're fooled. We have to be able to develop enough intelligence to understand when we have been fooled by propaganda, by propagandists. And I think part of it also is an emotional block, which is that there's a certain amount of fear that we have when we stand apart from the crowd. And we have to be willing to deal with that and follow truth wherever it may lead us. And this was, one of the things that I liked about this quote from Huxley, actually, ironically. But now I'm following that truth too. And if it turns out that Huxley is part of the problem, then I'm going to have to admit that I was fooled. So I guess that's the big issue here, is to be humble when we are fooled, and to get the intellectual tools we need to recognize when there is propaganda. Textual inconsistency and disinformation are things that all of us can learn to recognize. So I think that's the real message here, is to be humble and develop our intellectual awareness so that we can overcome the mind control that all of us suffer from.
And I think when a lot of people they just get so in denial, I couldn't have been fooled, it can't be me. Rather than, what, that was really good, you got me, you laugh it off, and then it's far less likely to happen to you again. But if you sit there and stay in denial, then, it's much more likely that you're going to get caught into the same type of thing in the future.
That's right. The only way we can begin to reform the propaganda agencies and agents is to be able to recognize that all of us have been fooled, and learn how to keep it from happening again and again. That's right.
Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
I think that 2014 can be a really important turning point. It seems that in America, we want to talk about economic inequality. We want to talk about the lack of transparency in our banks, in our stock market, in our intelligence agencies. So I think this could really be a year that will bring change. And it's ironic because all of this nonsense about 2012 is now over, but maybe this is the time when we make it come true, that it will be a new era and we'll deal with these issues. I really hope that's what happens, is that we'll deal with the issues of lack of transparency and inequality of information as well as income.
The word apocalypse means to reveal rather than like to annihilate, and that's the, you know.
That's what we need to do. That's
exactly.
Right. Okay, thank
Jay,
you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Hi, this is Sarah Parker Grubb, and you're watching Gnostic Media. Remember, always do your grammar first. Thank you for watching Gnostic Media. Check out our bookstore. You can get bookmarks, bumper stickers, the Holy Mushroom, the Sacred Mushroom, and the Cross, the 5-year archive. Thank you for watching our latest episode. Remember, don't take it personally. And please, do your grammar before contacting us. That's who, what, when, where, before why. Read the article, read the video, listen to the podcast before contacting us. We greatly appreciate it. Appeal to flattery. It's so hot when you do your grammar before contacting us. Appeal to popularity. All the cool people do their grammar before contacting us. If you like what Gnostic Media has been bringing you, please make a donation.